Namaste and welcome to AIDIA Dialogue. In this episode of AIDIA Dialogue, I am going to talk with Dr. David Molden, Director General of International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, ICIMOD, mainly focusing on the key question related to the report titled the Hindu Kush Himalaya Assessment 2019. The report outlined the severe scenario. For instance, two-thirds of Himalayan glaciers could melt by century if the existing carbon emission trajectory continues. And indeed, it is truly alarming for the region, which holds more than 1.6 billion population. I will discuss more with the Director General of ICIMOD. Dr. David, welcome to AIDIA Dialogue.
Thank you very much and welcome to ICIMOD.
Thank you, and it's a great honor to have you on this show.
And wonderful to talk to you.
The pleasure is all ours.
Okay.
To begin with, I'd like to ask a very general question. Every one of us know the hazard of climate change, but still we don't take it seriously. We know it's there, but we don't take any step. Can you just elaborate more about this psychology?
Yes, I think that's even a more difficult question than the questions about climate change itself, human behavior. But I think a few things. One is that climate change takes place over a long period of time, and a lot of times we need a shock to change our behavior. And actually dealing with climate change is very much about changing our behavior to be cleaner, to be more respectful to the environment. So all of us have difficulty in change.
What element can act as a shock to change in our behavior?
Well, I think,
in a positive way, I mean.
Yeah, in a positive way. I think just the shocks that do happen from climate change. And sometimes that's what we don't intentionally try to shock people with science, but some of the answers are indeed quite shocking. Kind of gives us a wake-up call when we can tell people about what's happening with climate change. And we're hoping that leads people to action and leads people to change.
Getting back to our theme, ICIMOD recently released a report titled as the Hindu Kush Himalaya Assessment 2019. And you know, it created a lot of attention nationally and internationally as well. Before moving towards the core substance of our subject, could you tell us more, how do we need to understand the Hindu Kush Himalaya region more clearly?
Right, so good. So first, I feel privileged to work in this Hindu Kush Himalayan region, right? And it's a wonderful mountain range and the hills associated with it, stretching clear from Afghanistan to Myanmar. So it's a huge area. It also covers the Hindu Kush Mountains, the Karakoram, the Himalayas, as well as the Tibetan Plateau. And it's a region shared by 8 countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, China, Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, and Myanmar. It's also an extremely important source of natural resources for the Asia region. So if you think about the water that comes from the mountains, think about the incredible biodiversity in the mountains. Think about just the diversity of people who live in the mountains, all with their own ideas about life. And then we think about products like agriculture or energy that some way are related to mountains. So we feel this area is important, yes, for mountain people, but very much for Asia and very much for the globe. And by the way, I feel everybody in the world knows about Himalaya, Nepal, Sagarmatha, Mount Everest as well. So it's an incredibly important resource for all of us.
To shed more light on the report, one of the most alarming claims made in this report was, I quote, "In the future, even if global warming is kept to 1.5 degrees Celsius, warming in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region will likely be at least 0.3 degrees Celsius higher. And in the Northwest Himalaya and Karakoram, at least 0.7 degrees Celsius higher." Tell us more about reason behind the high vulnerability of HKS and its effect in the whole region and beyond.
Right, good. So what happens in the mountain areas is with global warming, it gets hotter, faster at higher elevation. So that's why we say if the world were to increase by 1.5 degrees by 2100, actually the mountain areas would be hotter, maybe 1.8, 2 degrees. In fact, if we are on our current trend with emissions, with carbon dioxide emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, the way we're currently doing that, it's likely that the temperature will go up in mountains, say, by 5 degrees. And that, in many ways, is an unspeakable or even unthinkable consequence of climate change. Now, I had mentioned before about the mountains being an important resource base, but it's also a very fragile ecosystem, right? A lot of times, and people live far away with difficult access. It's also, the mountain area is also in one way home to very resilient mountain people, but always struggling with issues like malnutrition or poverty. And so you also see trends like outmigration of people. So in this very already vulnerable environment without climate change, then you see this climate change impact hit, right? With the temperatures going up. But what does that mean? It means the glaciers will melt faster, right? It also means that the monsoon, the rainfall patterns, are likely to change in the future. It means that we might see more heavy rainfall followed by more drought period. Too much water when you don't want it, too little water when you really need water, right? It means also that ecosystems, right, where trees grow will change. It means that agriculture systems may change. So already we hear farmers talking about insects and pests growing at higher elevation. Some of it may not all be bad. So for example, apples might grow up in higher elevations, say in Mustang.
But the negative consequences are more
I think
visible.
the negative consequences.
And do you think, are we doing more or adequate to prevent all these adverse situations regarding climate change?
I think we've got a lot of work to do, and a lot of work quickly on two ends. One is, as a global community, to stop emitting greenhouse gases, to really lower our emissions so that we can stop climate change. And secondly, for people in the mountains to help adapt to such changes. And we need to do this quickly in mountain areas. And that's what the report is also telling us.
So compared with many other mountain areas of the world, HKS hazards are likely to be more severe due to young mountains and all.
Yeah, so that you're right, the mountains are young, so the probability of, say, landslides is higher. I actually think that in many mountain areas of the world, say if you go to the Andes in South America, it's very similar. But what's more striking about this Hindu Kush Himalayan region is the dependence of so many people on the mountains. So you have about 240 million people living in mountains, and about 1.6 billion people depending on the water resources downstream. So it's like if climate change hits the mountains, it's going to affect so many people, 2 billion people at least. But if we consider the food, then it could be more than that, 3 billion. So this region is a particular concern, right, to Asia and to the world. So I think it's like there's been a lot of attention to small island states, but really the Hindu Kush Himalayan region needs to be right up there as far as global concern as with, say, small island states or the Arctic as well.
So being more particular, can you just highlight its adverse effect on Nepal?
So what I think is first, the water resource situation changes. Nepal is dependent on water for irrigating its rice crops. With the river systems, with the monsoon patterns changing, that's likely to have adverse impacts. I think disasters is likely to be more, right? The hazards of disasters are certainly there for more floods, more droughts, more landslides as we're moving into the future. If we even think about energy, Nepal is very keen to develop and rightly develop its energy resources with hydropower. But we have to be very careful now about the river systems and the threat of these floods on hydropower as well in the future. So I think it is definitely of great concern to Nepalese people as well.
You just mentioned the changes in the environmental pattern as a result of climate change.
Yeah.
I'm more interested in this subject. Can you just highlight with some of the recent example we are facing here in Nepal, the change in environmental pattern?
Yeah. So I think the striking part of the report that got a lot of attention was the impact on glaciers, right? So what it's saying is in a 1.5 degree world, that's what that would be. If we could do everything right quickly, we could reach a 1.5 degree world. We would still lose 1/3 of our glaciers. If on the other hand, we're not acting on climate change, we would lose 2/3 of our glaciers. So that's already quite serious. And the aquatic environment with changes in monsoon patterns and river systems will also change. But in addition to that, if we think about where trees grow, I mean, because Nepal is so much dependent on its slope, we'll see more ecosystems moving up slope. We'll see the habitat of different birds, insects, wild animals changing as well into the future. We'll also see, it's possible we'll see more disease vectors like mosquitoes going up higher as we're moving into the future. So it's quite serious effect on the environment and thereby people as well.
So talking about the change in environmental pattern and its consequences, you just mentioned you've been in Nepal, you are in Nepal since long. You just said it's been like 7 years.
Yeah.
How do you assess, how seriously are we taking all these issues, like be it melting of glaciers, the adverse effect of climate change, global warming, and so many other issues? Are we serious enough?
If I look globally, not very many people are serious enough, and that's the change globally we have to make. I would say that Nepal takes it more seriously than other parts of the world, by the way. So I think that's a good news. Certainly, if speaking to government officials, they are very much concerned about the issue of climate change. So again, it goes back to your original question. We're concerned, but are we taking the action to do something about it? And that's what we have to keep reminding ourselves, to do something.
So talking about climate change and its adverse effect, I just mentioned our glaciers are melting, our rivers are shrinking. What's your take on this? Who has failed here as an institution, as an individual, or as a nation? Like, what's going wrong?
Yeah, so I think what we have to recognize is where are the greenhouse gases coming from that causes climate change. It's not from mountain people. It's typically people from the rest of the world who are emitting greenhouse gases. Mountain people, very little. So in a way, it's not fair that they're bearing the brunt of climate change. In fact, the poorest people are bearing the brunt of climate change. So I think it's just a definite issue. We've had the deliberations on climate change at a global level, but all of us have to take it more seriously. Now, I believe what countries in the mountain region also have to do is take these efforts to adapt to change seriously and move as quickly as possible on that front.
Taking back your point, least developed and developing countries argue that the adverse effect occurring from climate change, they don't have to do anything with that. They don't have major stake in that. So a recent report of ICIMOD also says the per capita fossil fuel carbon dioxide emission from the HKH countries is 1/6 of the global average. However, the region immensely suffer from this. So your take on this?
Yeah, I think the take is that we have to be telling the world that we're bearing the brunt of that influence. But I do have another take on it. I mean, one is and because I'm living here, I can say that. We can say, okay, everybody else is causing the problem. I'm just going to blame everybody else. But the other way to do it would be to say, let's set an example of how we can use more renewable energy, right? More electric vehicles, that we can reduce our own air pollution in this region. So the idea is, if the people in the countries here can set an example that says, hey, we're doing our part, even though it's a little bit, you, the rest of the world, please get together and play your part to solve the problem. I think that's a good way also to take the message that I would like to give.
And the rest of the world will hear that, because most of the developing countries are saying this since a long time, but nobody listens to that.
Yeah, so you know, one action that I think is really important is we all have kind of, you know, as a united voice, we will do better on the global stage, right? So what I notice with the small island states, they've united to express their concern, and I believe they have made a difference on that. I think the stories we hear from the Arctic does make a difference in people's minds, right? So I think what we have to do is get a common voice for mountain issues, one amongst the 8 countries who share the Hindu Kush Himalayan region, but also the global mountain community can have a much stronger voice, united voice telling the story. Now I think what else happens is there are a lot of people who are convinced, and think about the young people in the world. Think about Greta Thunberg, for example. If we can reach out and work with the youth, I think that kind of voice will make a difference. So we just have to keep working together to get that.
Don't you think it's the other way? A lot of time, powerful voice often get spotlight, rather than the collective voice from developing countries or least developing nations.
That may be the truth, but it's what we have to work against, right? So I think one is, do we just sit back and
how
take
can
it,
we bridge the gap?
Well, that's what I think is that I think we have to do our best science. We have to communicate better. I think we have to make alliances with youth groups and in my opinion, just do more. And I think actually Nepal is taking a leadership on the issue. And it is not surprising. Nepal has a special place in the global community. People love this country. And I think that voice also makes a difference as well.
Let us also talk about the environmental governance. The report sharply pointed out that, and I quote, researchers and practitioners consider poor governance as the 3rd most important factor after disasters and climate change, which poses the greatest threat to the prosperity of the HKS region. Can you just elaborate more on this?
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. So what the researchers putting together the assessment were visualizing different worlds, right? And one world that says, okay, it's collapsing, going downhill. And there climate change, disasters, and governance came out as key factors. Actually, what we'd like to do is find a path to prosperity. But governance turns out to be a key issue. And so think of the 8 countries in the region. At the regional scale, it seems it's sometimes noted as the least integrated, or one of the least integrated regions on Earth, where countries have difficulty talking to each other or negotiating issues. And then in the region, in addition, there are 5 of the least developed countries, and as well as it is a conflict-prone region because of resources. So governance is difficult, and I think a lot of countries are making progress on this issue. So what we feel is people really have to pay attention to governance, one, to get the voice of people into governance and pay attention to equity. But a big part of the report was saying about climate change, what we have to do is within the 8 countries who share the mountain to jointly govern that resource better, right? And so if you think about floods, a lot of times, remember the Koshi floods came from Nepal and went to India. Actually, the Kosi Basin starts in China, right? Think about climate change in the water. It has impacts past boundaries. Think about air pollution, where a lot of the pollution also moves across countries. So from the plains, it comes up here to Kathmandu as well. So if we can, and natural resources, say ecosystems, that plants and animals don't know borders. So if we could manage this better across borders, right, we could have a better chance of adapting to climate change. if together countries could say with a united voice and talk about climate change, we can manage the issues better. So a lot of the attention was put on actually governance, but at a regional level as well as national and local level too.
Talking about environmental governance and the initiation led by government, as you are working closely with the government of Nepal, can you just share some of your opinions or experiences regarding climate change, how difficult it is to work with the government to cope and to tackle with the adverse effect of environment?
Yeah, I think actually from our experience, the Nepal government has been quite keen in working together with communities to figure out how to adapt to change. The government here has been very good at addressing environmental concerns. And also it's interesting, the government announced a Sagarmatha Dialogue, right, which would bring mountain countries together. So it's kind of Nepal taking a leadership amongst the countries to address these concerns. Now, having said that, it's easy, it's easy to say, yes, let's do something, but the action is actually quite complex and needs a lot of learning and working together. So I think it does take time, and I think the positive efforts that we see with the government and people, and I think the government wants this as well, should be accelerated. And I feel the Nepal government, during my time, has been quite positive about this.
Can you highlight the major environmental policy reform initiative and mechanism for regional cooperation which should be undertaken for ensuring sustainable development of this region, the whole region?
Yeah. So we have to face the political reality that a lot of discussions are complex, right, between countries. But there are a lot of issues that are relatively easier to discuss. And I can name a few of those. Just based on humanitarian concerns, governments do share information about disasters like floods. And think of the experience with the earthquake when all different countries were coming to Nepal to help out. So if we can talk about issues like let's prepare for disasters or respond to disasters, that's a place where we can connect easily between countries. If we think about biodiversity conservation, this is an area also where countries, in our experience at ICIMOD, have agreed to work together on different landscapes, say, shared by India, China, and Nepal, right? But it's not that controversial of a topic. We also find at ICIMOD that science itself brings people together. So we routinely at ICIMOD bring scientists from the 8 different countries who very much collaborate on science of climate change, and they can go bring those messages back. So if I were picturing this moving forward, we do have some examples, say from the Arctic Council, where 8 countries, we have 8 countries here, got together and share information, and these are also very complicated, Soviet Union, United States at that time, who actually did get together around the environment to discuss key issues. The Alpine Convention is there as another example, and there could be something like that for the Hindu Kush Himalaya, right, where 8 countries are getting together, having a platform to discuss, say a science policy forum every year, or perhaps something like an HKH convention here, or council.
As we all know, climate change is a long battle we need to fight collectively. But recently, United States President Donald Trump had withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, saying that it's a hoax prepared by Chinese. And we know that US is the 2nd largest carbon emitter of the world. How do you analyze the confronting scenario and how to cope up with this kind of statement?
I think United States has to be at the table for climate change discussions. I think the countries in this region should do their best to convince the government of US to do that. And I also feel that there are people in the US who very much are with the HKH countries on climate change issues, and the political situation in all countries change. So I think it is a long game, and yes, we'll find ups and downs, but somehow we just have to keep our energy together in addressing those issues.
To conclude this, I would like to ask, change begins from the moment we decide to do a little bit from our side as well. Can you just suggest any measure we as an individual take part in it? Like, what can we do as an individual to reduce all the hazard?
I think it's fantastic. I think all of us should agree to do one or two or three things. And just a few examples, the air pollution, right, in Kathmandu is also driving climate change. So it's not all from outside. The air pollution generated locally also contributes to climate change. So if we could stop, for example, burning our waste, don't put the match to burn your waste, right? Try to recycle, reduce, reuse as much as possible. I think we can think about, the carbon emissions when we're driving our cars and try to reduce those as much as possible. And I think just do the best we can to take care of Mother Earth, Mother Nature, just be aware that what all of us do have an impact on one another as we're moving forward.
Thank you, Dr. David, for your insight, thoughts, and time. It's really wonderful having you on the show.
Yeah, thank you for giving the opportunity to explain our work, and thanks also for your excellent questions. Thank you very much.